Qyburn stood within the old stone tower that the Night's Watch had abandoned decades ago, scrutinizing a fragment of bone cradled in his palm. Though the place was nameless on any map, he had discovered it himself some months ago, guided by scraps of old letters and forbidden texts that he kept carefully hidden from prying eyes. There was no fire in the hearth. The cold air coiled around him like a serpent, but he felt no discomfort. His black robes were lined with furs he had taken from the corpse of a whiteless man near the Frostfangs. Yet it was not fur or fire that warmed him. The heat inside him came from a far darker source. He was close to accomplishing something extraordinary, something that no maester in Old Town could have ever imagined in their grandest heretical fancies. He tilted his head, letting the torchlight fall across the piece of bone he held. It was a shard from a wight that had crumbled under dragonfire, or perhaps it had been ordinary flame. He couldn't recall precisely. The shard was small, but in it he sensed a quiet resonance of powers he had only begun to comprehend. He pressed a fingertip against the jagged surface, feeling a faint tingling, like a distant echo of sorcery. Months of experimentation had led him here. Endless nights spent dissecting the reanimated remains of men, beasts, and other curious abominations that roamed the far north. And of course, he had his success with the mountain Ser Gregor, that towering shadow who had returned from death half-silent and more lethal than ever. Yet this new knowledge transcended even that monstrous feat. Outside, the wind howled across the winter-blasted land. Here, well beyond the wall in the heart of endless snow, Qyburn was at last free from the incessant scrutiny of lords and ladies, away from King's Landing with all its fineries and hidden knives. Yet he had found supporters in the strangest places. The promise of dominion over the living and the dead could inspire even the most fearful souls to follow him. He had watchers posted around this small keep, though they lacked the discipline of real soldiers. Mercenaries from across the narrow sea, cutthroats from Flea Bottom, men who had followed him north on the promise of riches and a measure of power. They guarded him from roving wights, from wildling raiders, from anything that lurked beyond the flickering ring of torchlight. And in return, he offered them glimpses of the unnatural, revelations of forces that most men would shun for fear of losing their very souls. His other hand rested on an ancient tome. The vellum pages were brittle, the writing in a language that had likely not been read in millennia. Even so, Qyburn had pieced together the meaning, secrets of reanimation, certain references to lore older than the first men. It spoke of the White Walkers in elliptical phrases, calling them the others, describing them as death's hand come to punish mortal hubris. But Qyburn did not see them as punishers or omens. He saw them as living, no, unliving proof that necromancy was not only possible but infinitely pliable. If the magic existed in the Night King's cold hand to raise the dead, if it existed in the swirling energies animating the thousands of wights across the tundra, then he, Qyburn, could harness it. He imagined the Night King, centuries old or perhaps older, wearing that frozen crown and leading an army of lifeless thralls. The realm had always feared the threat of the long night, the inevitable march of the undead upon the living. But Qyburn envisioned something else entirely. A new order, shaped not by the White Walkers but by his own hand. If necromancy could be learned, if he could cast aside the shackles of ignorance, then he would not merely be a timid puppet cowering before the other's ancient power. He would be the one to challenge the Night King's supremacy. He closed his eyes and recalled the day he left King's Landing. It had not been a public affair. Cersei had known of his departure, though not of his true intentions. The Queen had busied herself with fortifying the capital, seeing enemies everywhere. Daenerys Targaryen with her dragons, Jon Snow and his Northern Alliance, the scattered houses that pledged no loyalty to the Iron Throne. She had been content to allow Qyburn to wander off if it meant he might return with some new secret weapon, though she had never demanded details. That was the beauty of Cersei's tyranny. As long as she believed he would bring back something that could preserve her grip on power, she gave him free rein. He remembered how he had bowed, murmured a few hollow assurances of loyalty, then slipped away in the cold dawn with a small entourage. They had traveled first to the Citadel under the guise of needing certain restricted texts from the library's darkest vaults. As a maester, well, a former maester, Qyburn still had ways of moving through Old Town's labyrinthine corridors. He had left with more than a few forbidden tomes, some scrolls on Valyrian blood magic, and treatises that speculated on the children of the forest and their archaic runes. Then they had gone north, always north, gleaning rumors from villagers of monstrous shapes in the night, of whites and white walkers crossing the ice. He had bribed black market traders, rummaged through deserted towers, and finally settled here, where the boundary between life and death seemed thinnest. A faint rasp at the tower door roused him from his reverie. He slipped the shard of bone into his pocket and closed the tome before calling for the visitor to enter. A man stepped inside, a middle-aged sellsword named Torjen, with a face half-swallowed by a ragged beard. He was dressed in thick hides, a sword at his hip. His eyes were fearful, but there was a flicker of excitement as well. Torjen gave a cursory bow. "There's movement outside," he said, breath billowing in the cold. "We saw a few of them out on the plain. Whites, I think, or maybe just wildlings. But they look slow. One's missing an arm. Should we take them or wait?" Qyburn smiled thinly. "Bring them in if you can, alive or intact. Let us see if they still carry the spark." Torjen swallowed. "Aye, as you say." He lifted the torch he carried, flame dancing, and flicked his gaze to the dark tome on the table. "You been reading that again?" Qyburn's voice turned sharp. "I will tell you what I find when I find it. Now hurry. If those creatures are whites, I want them in the courtyard before the next hour. Go." The sellsword bowed again and withdrew. The door groaned shut behind him, leaving Qyburn alone with his private darkness. He exhaled softly. The spark. That was the word he used for the strange energy that animated the whites. It was a term wholly inadequate to the complexity of the phenomenon, but it served its purpose. If these newly spotted creatures truly were whites, then the spark would be present, feeble though it might be away from its controlling intelligence. Each time Qyburn captured one, he studied it, measured the pulses of magic with instruments he had cobbled together from steel, dragonglass, and shards of old crystals. Most of his attempts had failed or ended in the final destruction of the white, but he had gleaned crucial lessons each time. At length, he stepped away from the table and gathered his tools. A few glass vials, some filled with pale liquids that glowed faintly in the torchlight, and a scalpel. He no longer trembled at the prospect of slicing into corpses that still moved. His scientific curiosity was too great, and any reservations he might have once had died with his maester's chain. The memory of that day, when he was stripped of his chain for unnatural practices, only spurred him onward. The archmasters had been blind to the possibilities of life and death, but he saw them. Time passed slowly. Outside, he heard muffled shouts, grunts, the clang of steel. It was likely Torjen and the other sellswords cornering the whites. One did not simply kill a white if one aimed to study it, so they had to use ropes, nets, or brute force. Many men had perished trying to capture the undead, but Qyburn could always promise coin and questionable glories to secure replacements. At last came a triumphant roar from the courtyard. Qyburn slid open the thick oak door and descended the narrow stairs, stepping out into the biting cold. The courtyard was ringed with spiked palisades, half buried in snowdrifts. Torches hung in iron sconces, their flames guttering in the fierce wind. Men in heavy cloaks were gathered around a small group of figures that lay trembling in the snow. As Qyburn approached, the men stepped aside to let him pass. Two whites lay bound, arms and legs roped tightly. Both had once been men, or so it appeared. Their skin was blue-white with frostbite, hair matted with ice crystals, eyes blank and milky. One indeed lacked an arm. The stump looked old and blackened, as if it had rotted away. The other had half of its face chewed away, revealing the dull gleam of frozen bone. Even in this pitiful state, each white still snarled silently, jaws snapping at the air. Dark fluid oozed from their lips when they moved. Torjen, panting, gestured at the captives with his sword. They didn't put up much of a fight this time, almost as if something else was controlling them. Then it left them. We found them just wandering out in the tundra. Qyburn knelt slowly, hardly minding that the wet snow seeped through his robe. He examined the shattered teeth in the half-faced white's jaw, the rim of ice clinging to its hollow cheeks. Carefully, he brought a small glass vial near its mouth. The white snapped, clacking its teeth against the vial. Qyburn managed to swipe the rim of the container across the vile black fluid and seal it quickly with a cork. The men around him shifted uneasily. He rose. Move them into the lower hall. That's where I keep my instruments. I want to see how lively they remain away from the cold. You know what to do. The cell's words knew the drill. 2 of them hauled one white. 2 more grabbed the other by its legs, dragging them toward the tower's entrance. Qyburn followed with measured steps, ignoring the muffled groans of pain as one white stump scraped across the jagged ground. These were not men, not truly. Their souls, if indeed they had once possessed souls, were gone. Only the animating necromancy remained. Downstairs in the lower hall, the men chained the captives to iron rings set in the stone floor. The ring for the armless white had to be threaded around its shoulders and chest, but eventually they managed to restrain them both, leaving space enough for Qyburn to move around and conduct his experiments. They had done this countless times before. "Stand back," Qyburn said. "You may watch if you wish, but keep your distance." He took a torch from the nearest sconce and wedged it into a bracket so he could see. Then, carefully, he produced his scalpel. He began his examination, first making shallow incisions into the white skin, watching for movement of the dark fluids within. There was no pulse, of course, no heartbeat, yet some sort of blackened residue seeped out with each cut, thick and congealed. The white jerked and snapped its teeth. Qyburn calmly proceeded, unperturbed. He measured the temperature of the fluid, placed small droplets into other vials containing concoctions that might reveal chemical properties. His onlookers, those cell's words who were braver or more curious than their peers, stood in a half-circle, their breath caught in their throats. Some turned away when the stench grew stronger, or when Qyburn used a wicked metal device to pry open a white's chest cavity. He took note of the dryness of the bones, the shriveled organs that no longer seemed to function. It was as if a puppet master's strings were laced throughout the corpse, defying all logic. The hours passed in a macabre ballet of bloodless dissections and Qyburn's relentless note-taking. In time, the whites stopped moving altogether. It happened quite suddenly, as if the spark animating them simply fled. Qyburn gently placed his hand against the white sternum, sensing the final flicker of that spark vanish. He sighed, disappointed, but not entirely. Each experiment yielded a clue. Perhaps the cold was the catalyst sustaining the magic. Or perhaps the Night King's proximity was crucial, and once the whites wandered too far, the bond weakened. Qyburn stood, noting the tingling in his fingers again, that faint resonance whenever he touched the undead. It was stronger now than it had been a fortnight past. He was sure of it. If he could harness that energy, channel it, perhaps he could replicate it within himself, become a conductor of the same power that the White Walkers used to command their host of corpses. He turned to the men. "Dispose of them. Burn them if you must, or store them outside if you can find a place. The cold won't let them rot further. I have what I need for now." The men nodded, grateful to be free of their duties, and set about removing the remains. Qyburn left them to it, returning to his private study in the tower's upper chambers. He passed narrow windows that let in the wan light of the afternoon. From one such window, he glimpsed the vast expanse of snow-laden fields, the ragged skeletons of trees, distant mountains caked in ice. And out there, somewhere, walked the White Walkers, the Night King among them, orchestrating his unstoppable legion. Qyburn's mouth set in a thin line. It was said that the Night King's reanimated corpses were linked to his will, that destroying him would fell them all. That might have been some poetic exaggeration, but if it was true, then it only confirmed what Qyburn suspected. The power to reanimate was ultimately a single, centralized force that commanded an entire legion. He had discovered, during a certain risky incantation, that a lesser spark could be drawn from a white into a living subject, though he had yet to see any measurable change in the subject besides madness. But if that lesser spark could be isolated and grown, if it could be magnified, then perhaps he could wrest control of the whites from the Night King himself. He closed the door of his study and pored over the texts once more, searching for references to a hidden ritual or an arcane formula that might allow him to break the Night King's hold. The day slipped away into dusk, and dusk into a moonless night. He ate sparingly cold bread, dried meat, and drank water that tasted faintly of metal. A single torch burned low in the corner. He did not sleep. The pages spoke of runes carved into weirwood, of the children's old gods. They spoke in riddles, of living fire and endless ice, of the balance that had once existed between life and death, and of those who had tried to tip the scales in their favor. He recalled how the mountain of a man he had reanimated in King's Landing, that silent beast known as Sir Robert Strong, or simply the New Mountain, had been partially bound to him. Granted, Circe believed that it was bound to her, but Qyburn remembered the final steps of that necromancy, the faint thread of submission that tethered the undead knight to his own will. It was not complete. He had lacked the correct knowledge, but it had been enough to ensure the knight recognized Qyburn's authority. Could that same principle be applied to the Night King's whites on a grander scale? He ran his fingertip over a scribbled line in the ancient text. The living must be the conduit. It was circled by some long-dead scholar, with exclamation marks scrawled in the margin. The living must be the conduit. He closed his eyes, meditating on the phrase. He suspected it meant that a living sorcerer must directly channel the undead energies, bridging the gap between the living world and the domain of death. Perhaps that was the key. A short while before dawn, he made his decision. Summoning a cluster of sellswords, he instructed them to prepare for travel. They would venture farther north, beyond the expanse of tundra. Word had it that there were larger hosts of whites roaming near the edges of the haunted forest, commanded by White Walkers themselves. If Qyburn hoped to glean the final secret, he needed to witness these creatures in their natural habitat, and perhaps take greater risks. Torjen and the others voiced their hesitation. They had seen whites in small numbers, but to face a horde, led by the actual others, was borderline suicidal. But Qyburn offered them richer promises. Gold and treasures hidden away long ago, once the living were no longer a threat to him. He possessed a cunning silver tongue and enough glimpses of black sorcery to persuade them that, if they followed him, they might become more than petty sellswords. And so they agreed, though fear shone plainly in their eyes. They departed at first light, leaving a skeleton crew behind to guard their miserable tower. The wind sliced across their faces as they trudged onward, horses struggling to find footing on the icy terrain. Qyburn rode atop a shaggy Garen pony, a gift from a wildling chieftain who had once traded with them, too fearful or desperate to refuse Qyburn's coin. He and his men moved slowly, sometimes traveling in single file across narrow ridges. The snow fell in swirling gusts, obscuring the horizon. Each night, they made camp in abandoned ruins or half-collapsed watchposts the Night's Watch had once built. Qyburn spent those nights poring over his notes, sometimes venturing outside the circle of fires to stare at the darkness. More than once, he believed he could sense that faint resonance again, stronger out here in the deep north. He dreamt of skeletal hands, an endless sea of milky eyes, and a tall figure crowned by ice, beckoning him forward. On the 5th day of travel, they emerged onto a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Half buried in snow stood the remnants of an ancient wildling village, little more than a scattering of wooden frames. The valley beyond was vast, shimmering under pale sunlight. That was when they saw them, a column of whites, dozens strong, shuffling across the open plain. Their movement was eerily unified, as if guided by a single mind. And there, amidst them, figures taller and leaner, draped in armor of frost, with flesh like pale ice. White Walkers. One of the sellswords, a man named Dennis with a scar across his cheek, whispered a prayer under his breath. Another cursed. Qyburn felt his heartbeat quicken, not with fear, but with exhilaration. So many. If he could capture one of those White Walkers, if he could discover the secret that danced behind its crystalline gaze, then victory might be within reach. They pulled back, deciding to follow the procession from a safe distance, careful to keep behind outcroppings of ice. The band of whites and their masters seemed to be heading east, perhaps toward Hardhome or some other vantage. Qyburn and his men trailed them for miles, never drawing too close. The whites marched in endless monotony, dragging weapons or clawing at the snow. The White Walkers rode pale steeds, undead horses, equally lifeless but moving in that silent, eerie way. Occasionally, one of the White Walkers would glance around as if sensing watchers, but the swirling snow provided cover. Finally, the undead column paused near the edge of a frozen lake. Qyburn and his sellswords crouched behind a wind-carved ice formation, peering at the spectacle. One of the White Walkers dismounted, stepping lightly across the ice. With a slow, deliberate motion, it knelt and pressed a hand against the lake's surface. A crack echoed across the valley, but the White Walker seemed unbothered. Its brethren stood watch, their swords glistening with a strange blue radiance. Qyburn's eyes narrowed. He felt a tingling in his core, a stirring of the powers he had been courting. He could almost taste the sorcery that crackled in the air. The whites stood in perfect stillness, as if waiting for a command. He swallowed, forcing himself to remain calm. This was precisely what he had sought. A chance to see the White Walkers in action, to feel the wave of necromantic energy that bound the whites. If he could just tap into it somehow. He turned to Torjen. "I need one of those whites, preferably intact." Torjen stared at him, half in disbelief. "You're mad. If we go out there, they'll see us. A single White Walker is more than a match for any of us, and there's 3 or 4 or more. We'd be done for." Qyburn's expression hardened. "You followed me here for the chance to gain unimaginable power. This is how it's done. The White Walkers have their backs to us, and the whites are no faster than a lame donkey. You only need one. Lure it away if you must, but bring me one." Dennis, the scarred sellsword, sucked on his teeth. "Could be we shoot an arrow, get its attention, draw it away from the group. But the moment the White Walkers notice, they'll send the rest. They can probably outrun us on those horses. We won't stand a chance in open ground." Qyburn considered. "We'll do it by night. They can see well enough in the dark, I assume, but so can we with torches. We only need to be cunning. One white straying from the group, pretend to be a lost traveler, perhaps. Even the White Walkers might not trouble themselves over a single stray. Let's see if we can provoke that scenario." And so they waited. The day passed with glacial slowness. The undead column eventually resumed its march. Qyburn's party followed from a distance, until darkness wrapped the land in its quiet shroud. The moon was just a pale sliver, giving little light. The White Walkers halted again near a cluster of frost-rimed trees. They seemed to be waiting or scouting or simply resting. The whites milled about in a loose circle, some collapsing to the ground only to rise again a few moments later. It was now or never. Torjen and Dennis volunteered, and Qyburn selected a handful of others. Under Qyburn's instructions, they formulated a plan. Dennis would take a few men, creep close, and let themselves be seen by the nearest whites, then flee. Hopefully, 1 or 2 of the undead would follow, separated from the main group. Meanwhile, Qyburn and the rest would lie in wait behind a low rise, ready to ensnare the straggler with nets and ropes. They moved into position, hearts pounding, nerves taut. Qyburn crouched behind a mound of snow, gripping the hilt of a dagger coated with dragonglass dust. He had discovered that while fire or dragonglass could destroy whites, a small application of it could also disrupt the necromantic energy temporarily, stunning them. That was the plan, at least. He breathed slowly, forcing himself to remain calm as he watched Dennis and the others circle around to the edge of the undead camp. A torch flared in the gloom. Dennis made sure the light was visible, though distant enough that only a few whites might notice. Qyburn could see the shapes stirring in the darkness, slow and uncertain. Then Dennis shouted, a feigned cry for help that echoed across the snowy field. 2 or 3 whites lurched toward the sound, skeletal arms outstretched. Qyburn felt the tension in his chest relax slightly, It appeared the White Walkers hadn't stirred to investigate. Perhaps they paid little mind to a small disturbance. Dennis and his men ran, torch bobbing, drawing the whites away from the main horde. Qyburn turned to Torjen. "Now," he whispered. They moved quickly, rushing around the rise, the men with nets at the ready. The first white let out a rattling hiss as they closed in from behind, and it flailed, nearly catching Torgen's face with its frozen nails. But the men draped their heavy net over it, tangling its limbs. Another white, an older corpse with most of its torso missing, came shuffling after. Qyburn flicked his dragonglass dagger, scattering dark shards onto the second white's chest. A strange sizzling noise emanated, and the white jerked violently, then collapsed as though paralyzed. "Secure them," Qyburn ordered. His men wrestled the whites to the ground, binding them with ropes and chains. One man sustained a nasty scratch along his forearm, but soon enough, they had two writhing undead, trussed up like game. In the distance, Qyburn could see the bulk of the undead host hadn't moved. The White Walkers did not appear to have noticed, or else they chose not to intervene. Dennis trotted back, panting, torch sputtering in his hand. "All right," Torjen muttered. "We've got them, Qyburn. Now what?" Qyburn knelt by the smaller white, the one paralyzed by dragonglass dust, and placed a hand on its chest. The spark was still there, subdued but present. "Perfect. Now," he said, "we complete the conduit." With careful deliberation, he withdrew a small stone bowl from his pack, along with a flask of thick black fluid. He bit his lip in anticipation. This was the final piece of ritual that he had pieced together from texts older than the Seven Kingdoms. A method to siphon the necromantic bond from the white's body into his own living flesh. A dangerous gambit, but if it succeeded, it might allow him to tap directly into the Night King's domain. He poured the black fluid into the bowl. It had a foul, sulfuric stench. Then he nodded to Torjen. "Your dagger." Torjen hesitated. Qyburn seized Torgen's hand before he could protest further, pricked his palm with a small needle, and let a few drops of the man's blood fall into the black liquid. It sizzled. Torjen tried to pull away, but Qyburn held firm. "What in all the hells?" Torjen growled. "I need living blood," Qyburn said evenly. "To merge with the undead essence is a small price to pay." Torjen watched, uneasy, as Qyburn repeated the process on himself, letting his own blood drip into the bowl. Then, chanting softly under his breath, Qyburn dipped his fingers into the mixture and pressed them against the white's forehead. The paralyzed creature twitched, jaws gnashing weakly. Qyburn's eyes fluttered shut, and his voice rose in a chant that few men in Westeros had ever heard. The wind picked up, whipping around them in a sudden gust that extinguished several torches. A sense of oppressive cold settled over the scene, more profound than the mere winter chill. The men shivered, stepping back. Qyburn continued chanting, his voice straining as though fighting against an unseen tide. His mind reached out, searching for the spark within the white. He found it. A small, pulsing node of icy magic, connected by threads that led elsewhere to the White Walker's greater power. Qyburn latched onto that thread with his will, imagining himself as a fisherman hauling a net from dark waters. He pulled, and the white spark flared. The white's eyes rolled back, and its jaws fell slack. Qyburn felt a jolt as the necromantic energy rushed up the invisible line. His blood pounded in his ears. A swirl of contradictory sensations flooded him. Cold and heat, life and death. 1,000 silent voices screaming in a chorus of lost souls. The sensation was agony and ecstasy intertwined. He gasped, nearly collapsing, but forced himself to maintain the chant, to keep pulling. Somewhere, in the swirl of darkness behind his closed eyelids, he saw a vision. The Night King standing on a vast frozen plain, his arms raised. The entire realm of the dead stretched behind him, countless whites awaiting command. Then the Night King turned his head, as if sensing Qyburn's intrusion. For an instant, their gazes locked, and Qyburn felt an unimaginable force pressing back. He refused to yield. Summoning every shred of will, every scrap of forbidden knowledge gleaned from years of unholy experiments, he shaped his chant into a warding spell, a funnel that would channel the stolen energy into himself. The white under his hand spasmed violently, black fluid leaking from its eyes. Qyburn opened his own eyes, teeth clenched. Then it was done. The white's eyes flickered, and the spark was no more. His body went limp and still, but Qyburn felt something inside him, a new presence, like a coil of living frost swirling through his veins. He was trembling, half in shock, half in triumph. He stared at his hand, which was slick with the black mixture. Tendrils of bluish vapor rose from it, fading into the night air. His entire arm tingled with unnatural power. A twisted smile curved his lips. The men exchanged uneasy glances. "What did you do?" Torjen asked, wiping the blood from his palm on the hem of his cloak. Qyburn slowly rose. He felt lightheaded, as if every nerve in his body was on fire. But he also felt the presence of other sparks in the distance. He could sense the whites that followed the White Walkers near the frosty copse. He could feel them as a cluster of flickers, pinned beneath the iron will of the others. But now Qyburn had a line of his own, a tenuous, fragile line, but one that existed. He pointed at the second white they had captured, the one still thrashing under the net. "Release it," he commanded. A few men muttered protests. He gave them a piercing look, and their protests died. They carefully removed the net, stepping back with swords drawn. The white rose slowly to its feet, a silent, rotted figure with bits of decaying cloth clinging to its frame. Its eyes glowed with the same eerie light that all whites shared. It hissed, raising its arms, as if ready to lash out. Qyburn took a breath, letting the cold power within him flow through his limbs. He extended his hand and willed the white to be still. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the white paused mid-snarl, as though confused. His gaze flicked to Qyburn. It let out a rattling moan, uncertain, torn between the hidden commands of its distant master and the new presence standing before it. Qyburn set his jaw and redoubled his will. He imagined an invisible chain lashing the white to him, commanding it to obey. The white quivered, as if struggling, but it did not attack. Instead, it staggered a step forward, arms dropping to its sides. An unnatural hush settled over the group. "Incredible," one man whispered. Qyburn's face was a mask of concentration. He could still sense the link that bound this white to the White Walkers. But now an alternative link was forming, a rival tether. The white seemed to be caught in a tug-of-war, unsure which master to follow. Yet it did not lunge for them. That alone was a triumph. Suddenly, a roar sounded from beyond the dark line of trees. The entire group spun, hearts lurching. Qyburn could feel a surge of cold power radiating from that direction, as if the White Walkers had sensed the intrusion. The white that Qyburn had ensnared let out a guttural cry, staggering backward. In the gloom, Qyburn saw the shapes of the White Walkers on their undead horses, silhouettes lit by starlight. They were coming, swords of ice in hand. The entire horde of whites trailed behind them, scraping through the snow. "Form up," Torjen bellowed, his voice cracking with fear. The men scrambled, some raising crossbows, others lighting torches. Qyburn clenched his fists, trying to steady the new link with the white at his feet. He sensed the Night King's will, a torrent of unimaginable might, sweeping across the field. This was not a mere lesser White Walker. This was something else, a presence vaster than the handful of figures approaching on horseback. Or perhaps the White Walkers were collectively channeling that presence. Regardless, Qyburn felt his mind assaulted by a wave of glacial fury. The white he had subjugated let out a shriek, as if in pain, falling to its knees. The second, newly empty white remained limp on the ground. The swirling powers threatened to tear Qyburn's mind apart. He had stolen a piece of the White Walker's necromancy, and they were not pleased. He let out a ragged snarl, pressing a hand to his temple as though to steady himself. He could not afford to lose the connection now. If he did, It would prove that the Night King's will was absolute, and all his efforts would have been for naught. But if he could hold on, if he could keep this white under his control even in the face of the White Walker's direct assault, then he would prove the possibility of dethroning them in their own domain of death. He forced himself to stand tall, ignoring the biting wind that swept across the plain. "Stand!" he hissed at the white under his command. "I command you!" The white struggled to rise, trembling, moaning, torn between two masters. Slowly it climbed to its feet. Qyburn felt a savage burst of satisfaction. He could sense the White Walker's confusion, their anger. This was the first crack in the Night King's edifice of control. The white took another step forward, turning away from the White Walker's approach. A single step, but enough to show Qyburn that it was indeed responding to him. Meanwhile, the enemy was nearly upon them. The Sellsword's torches flickered, revealing the unnatural forms of at least 3 White Walkers, their pale armor glistening, their eyes a piercing shade of blue. The one at the front raised its sword of ice, pointing at Qyburn's group. A hiss like the howling wind cut through the night. Behind them, a rank of whites advanced, dozens or more, stuttering across the snow. Dennis fired a crossbow bolt. It struck one of the White Walkers but shattered harmlessly on its icy armor. Another man hurled a lantern of fire, which made the whites recoil but did not stop them. Torjen raised his sword, calling out, "Fall back! We can't fight them all." But Qyburn did not move. He stood, enthralled by the raw power crashing against his mind. He glimpsed the White Walker's face. Gaunt, inhuman, framed by a crown of shards. Its eyes bored into him. The wave of freezing will intensified, and he felt as though a dagger of ice were stabbing through his skull. The white at his feet shrieked again, doubling over. The men around Qyburn flinched, uncertain whether to flee or stay. With a final act of determination, Qyburn poured all of his stolen necromancy into the white. "Kill that one," he whispered, voice trembling. He pointed at the White Walker brandishing the sword. "Kill your former master." Time seemed to slow. The white shuddered, letting out a strangled cry, then turned with jerky, lurching steps toward the White Walker. Qyburn could feel the tension, the White Walker's raging fury. A single white posed no threat to a White Walker ordinarily. And yet, this white was not moving under the White Walker's will. It was Qyburn's puppet now, an abomination that defied the usual chain of command. The White Walker snarled, stepping forward gracefully. It swung its sword of ice in a wide arc, intending to shatter the insolent puppet. The white, still hampered by the rope around its torso, stumbled. Qyburn tried to push it harder, but the White Walker's blade met the white's skull with a sound like crackling frost. The white's head split in two, and it collapsed in a heap of dead flesh. Qyburn felt the connection snap. The wave of cold power he had been resisting crashed inward, knocking him to his knees. He gasped, black spots dancing in his vision. The White Walker advanced, brandishing its blade. The Sellswords cried out, some flinging fire, others turning to run. With a hideous shriek, the rest of the white horde descended upon them. Chaos broke loose. Men howling, steel ringing, the stench of burning flesh as torches touched undead flesh. One of the White Walkers galloped toward Qyburn, astride its undead horse. He looked up, heart pounding. He had lost the puppet, but he still retained a shard of necromantic power within himself. Could he use it on a White Walker directly? Madness, perhaps, but what other choice did he have? He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the swirl of conflict around him, and locked eyes with the White Walker. The creature raised its sword. Qyburn focused on the coil of icy power within him, shaping it as best he could, forging an invisible blade of his own will. He unleashed a wordless cry, thrusting his hand forward. He imagined the White Walker's own magical essence, a swirl of frost and night. He tried to tear at it, disrupt it, as if unraveling a tapestry. For a heartbeat, he sensed the White Walker's confusion. It faltered, hesitating. Then its eyes blazed bright, and an overwhelming surge of freezing power slammed back at Qyburn. He was thrown off his feet, landing hard in the snow. His vision blurred with pain. The White Walker advanced, dismounting. 2 more White Walkers prowled in the background, and the Whites closed in, scattering the Sellswords like leaves in a storm. Torjen swung a flaming sword, decapitating a White, but 3 more pounced on him. Dennis and a few others tried to form a defensive line, but it was hopeless. Qyburn could see no path to victory. Yet as the White Walker raised its sword over Qyburn's prone form, a new sensation rippled through the air: heat. A sudden, unmistakable swell of warmth that parted the cold for an instant. Qyburn managed to roll to the side, lungs burning, as a plume of fire whooshed overhead. A torch? No, something brighter, hotter. In the confusion, Qyburn heard triumphant shouts. Through tear-blurred eyes, he glimpsed figures in thick cloaks brandishing flaming weapons. Men and women of the north, perhaps. Then he caught a flash of white fur. A direwolf, massive, bounding into the fray. Whites were torn asunder, and a swirl of metal clashed with ice. "Fall back!" someone shouted in a strong voice. "We have them outnumbered. Press forward. For the living." Qyburn struggled to rise, shielding his face from the swirling snow. He recognized the man's voice. Jon Snow, the so-called king in the north, though Qyburn had never met him in person. Indeed, as the swirl parted, he caught a glimpse of Jon wielding Longclaw, its Valyrian steel catching the moonlight. A White Walker lunged at him, but Jon parried, and the other's ice blade shattered upon contact with the Valyrian steel. A second slash, and the White Walker disintegrated into shards of mist. More northern soldiers poured onto the field, driving the Whites back with fire-tipped spears and dragonglass arrows. The White Walkers hissed in fury, but facing Valyrian steel and superior numbers, they began a strategic retreat. Whites collapsed as their controlling masters withdrew. In the end, the tide turned swiftly, leaving only broken, twitching corpses scattered across the snow. Qyburn found himself trembling on his hands and knees. The presence of necromantic power still churned inside him, but it felt raw and untempered, like an open wound. He watched as Jon Snow and a few companions stood over a melting patch of ice where a White Walker had just fallen. Jon stared at Qyburn with suspicion, brow furrowed. The survivors among Qyburn's Sellswords gathered around him, battered and bloodied. Torjen was nowhere to be seen, presumably torn apart by Whites. Dennis limped over, a wide gash along his ribs, but alive. They looked to Qyburn for guidance, but he had none to give. All he could do was stare at the swirling snowfall, uncertain how Jon Snow had arrived here at exactly the right moment. Jon, for his part, approached cautiously, sword still in hand. His companions, wildlings, some men of the Night's Watch and northern lords, fanned out behind him. Ghost, the direwolf, sniffed at the corpses of the Whites, occasionally growling. Qyburn forced himself to stand, favoring his injured side. He tried to adopt a knife-eyed posture, though he was covered in snow and grime. "Lord Snow," he managed, voice hoarse. "Or should I call you King in the North?" Jon narrowed his eyes. "I might ask who you are and what you're doing here, dealing with these demons." One of Jon's men, a young warrior with a frozen beard, spat on the ground. They were capturing Whites. Bargaining with them, it looked like. Qyburn's lips twisted in what might have been a smile. "Bargaining is not precisely the word. I am Qyburn, formerly of the Citadel. You have my thanks for arriving when you did. I was about to be killed." Jon's expression remained grim. "We didn't come for you. We've been scouting the edges of the White Walker's territory, searching for any advantage we can find. We heard the fighting, though I'm not sure if we saved you or if you were fighting beside them." Qyburn glanced at his battered men. "We share a common enemy, do we not?" Jon's face hardened. "Aye, but some are foolish enough to try to subvert that enemy's power rather than destroy it. Are you among those fools?" Qyburn hesitated, his mind racing. Jon was not a man easily deceived, but Qyburn had already glimpsed the possibility that the Night King's power could be taken. He wasn't about to abandon that dream simply because these northern warriors found him suspicious. Still, he needed to survive. Any advantage against the Night King must be studied, Qyburn said carefully. I seek knowledge, nothing more. The realm is imperiled, and I have been exploring ways to counter the White Walkers' hold on the dead. If we find a method to break the chain of command, we can free countless whites from their tyranny. John studied him in silence for a moment. Then he nodded to one of his companions, a tall wildling with a flaming axe. Check him for hidden weapons. See to the men, gather the injured, and watch our backs for any more whites. The wildling stepped forward, patting Qyburn down. He took away Qyburn's dagger, scowling at the black residue on the blade. Qyburn said nothing, careful to maintain an air of cooperation. A few Sellswords tried to protest, but they were too wounded to resist. Besides, Qyburn sensed that the tide had turned, and it was best to appear helpful, at least for the moment. John turned to stare at the half-frozen plain where the White Walkers had retreated. We should move. More could be coming. Qyburn nodded. There's a small keep a day's ride south of here, not well known, but I can lead you there. We have some supplies. John fixed him with a piercing gaze. And why would you help us? Qyburn conjured his most earnest expression. Because the dead are a threat to us all. You saw me nearly killed by them, and if not for your intervention, I would be lost. Perhaps we can aid one another. You have men and skill. I have knowledge of the arcane. Together, we may stand a better chance. For a moment, John did not reply. Then, slowly, he sheathed Longclaw. Very well. If you speak truth, then let's see this keep. But no tricks, Qyburn. Qyburn bowed his head. Of course. So it was decided. They gathered their wounded and their dead, as well as what little gear they could salvage. Then, under the pale light of the moon, they began the arduous journey south. Qyburn rode among them, carefully observing these new companions. Their presence might prove troublesome, but it also might present him with an opportunity. Jon Snow was said to have slain White Walkers before, and here was living proof. If Qyburn could learn the means to kill the Walkers with Valyrian steel, combined with his own necromantic infiltration of their domain, perhaps that was the path to toppling the Night King. As they rode, Qyburn felt the lingering fragment of undead power that still curled inside him like a serpent. He could sense the whites in the distance, moving with the White Walkers. He could feel the cold presence of something mightier still, a presence that had noticed him in that moment of defiance. The Night King. Even though they were separated by miles, Qyburn was certain the ancient being's awareness lingered on him, marking him as an aberration that needed to be crushed. His breath caught. He had glimpsed the Night King's gaze in that psychic clash, felt the weight of centuries behind that single, unblinking stare. The memory made his blood run cold. And yet, Qyburn also remembered how the White had momentarily obeyed him, how it had turned against its rightful master, however briefly. That spark of rebellion lit a fire in his heart that no winter wind could quell. He had proven that the Night King was not invincible, that the chain of undeath could be subverted. All that remained was to refine his methods, gather more power, and try again. Perhaps next time he would not be alone. They pushed onward through the night, men and horses shivering in the wind. Jon's direwolf ranged ahead, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Now and then, Qyburn would catch Jon glancing at him, suspicion and curiosity warring in the young king's eyes. Qyburn showed only an air of polite humility, offering what few words were needed, playing the part of a half-frightened scholar thrust into terrible circumstances. Inside, however, his mind churned with ambition and dark enchantments. Dawn broke in a wash of pale light as they found a sheltered valley near the keep Qyburn had once claimed. The men muttered with relief, anxious to find warmth and rest. A few watchers were posted, scanning the white horizon for any sign of whites. Qyburn stood by Jon, pointing out the trail that led to his tower. There, he said, we can be within the walls before midday with luck. The tower has enough space to house us, though it's not exactly the Red Keep. Jon eyed him. No illusions of comfort are needed, so long as it's defensible. Qyburn inclined his head, biting back a smile. He pictured the dark basement where he had conducted his experiments, the unholy texts laid out on rough-hewn tables, the instruments of necromancy scattered about. He would have to hide anything that might alarm these new allies. For the time being, he required their presence, their protection, and possibly their trust. But beyond that horizon, in the trackless wastes of the north, the Night King gathered his forces. The memory of that unstoppable host weighed on Qyburn's thoughts. Could he, through cunning and audacity, seize their reins and become a challenger to the great other himself? The idea was audacious, blasphemous, yet it was no less appealing. He had tasted the power, and it was unlike anything he had known. He raised his gaze to the endless sky. A single crow circled overhead, cawing once before flitting away into the distance. It seemed a fitting omen. Death and knowledge mingled in that lonely cry, echoing across a frozen land that cared nothing for kings or necromancers. Yet men like Qyburn refused to bow to fate, shaping it instead with their own designs. And so, beneath the vast and uncaring heavens, he stood, resolved. He would not be content to merely kneel before the coming storm. He would strive by any means to harness it, bending the powers of life and death to his will. As the caravan descended into the valley, he could almost hear the faint whispers of the dead on the wind, calling his name. Perhaps, in time, they too would kneel, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Night King himself would come to understand that the living were not so easily subdued, that among them walked those willing to peer into the darkness, to claim it as their own. Qyburn's lips curled into a quiet, secretive smile. The game was just beginning, and he intended to play it to the bitter end.